official start of the takedown of socialism in America.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ellis, for being with us.
It's a great privilege. Thank you.
Okay. I think this coronavirus epidemic really exposed some of the America's vulnerabilities, especially, for example, 80% of the key ingredient of the generic drugs is produced by China and India right now. But that's just one area. I mean, what's your assessment of the whole situation from this epidemic? I mean, do you think it exposed America is heavily reliant on China on too many things?
People like myself, President Trump, and many others for decades have been saying that America is too reliant on communist China for manufactured goods, for technological goods. And increasingly, we've actually been outsourcing our research and development to Chinese laboratories, if you will, Chinese research centers. And we've been saying this is a mistake. This is wrong, an incorrect path. George Washington recognized this. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton said the United States could not be truly independent if it was dependent on foreign sources for its manufactured goods. Mm-hmm. And they moved very decisively to create an American manufacturing sector. Mm-hmm. That was 250 years ago. And now history is repeating itself. Back in 1776, Britain was the workshop of the world. Today, Communist China calls itself and is referred to as the workshop of the world. America is now dependent on China for manufactured goods, technological goods. We were dependent on China for steel, aluminum, and most critically, pharmaceuticals, the drugs that we depend on to keep ourselves healthy, the protective gear, all the face masks and protective surgical garments that our hospital workers need. These are all made in China. And so we've become dependent on China the same way George Washington and Alexander Hamilton warned us against being dependent on Great Britain back then. So what we're seeing now, the coronavirus has brought this to everyone's attention. And it's no longer just a few of us, a few voices in the wilderness saying this is a mistake. And people are seeing a broad number of people. I see people on financial news channels that used to be cheerleaders for investing in China now saying it was a mistake to be totally dependent on China as a source for all our goods. And we meaning businesses, need to diversify. You can't be dependent on a sole supplier for anything. They teach you that in business school. If your company is dependent on a sole supplier, you're hostage to that sole supplier. They can jack up the price at any point and own you, put you out of business, and that's the end of the story. So I think the coronavirus is in a way, the silver lining to this very dark cloud is that people are becoming aware of some of the shortcomings of the decisions that were made decades ago.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly as you said. You said business sector is waking up to this. But if we look at how we get here, it's because in the past few decades, the profit-driven business sector has been dominating the U.S.-China policies. You said the business sector is starting to wake up to it, but is there enough source within the United States that can really drive this, fundamental change, a new policy?
Yeah, the problem has been it's twofold. Exactly as you say, the finance sector, it's Wall Street and the big banks, the finance sector has been driving investment in China. And the other dynamic that's been going on is the consolidation of various industries and almost monopolization of different industries. For example, the best example is Walmart and mass merchandising. Walmart was one company, one retailer that controlled such a huge part of the American retail market, mass merchandising, that they could go to any producer, somebody producing padlocks, gym lockers, notebooks for schools, clothing, whatever people buy and wear. and they say, okay, sell to us. If you sell to us, we'll be able to sell to the entire nation of America, and you won't need any other customers, and you don't have to worry about anything else. And everybody thought, what a great idea. I want to sell to Walmart. My homework is done. I'm home free. But then Walmart would say, okay, well, this is the price we'll pay. We want to sell it at, X price, retail, so we're going to pay you 1/2 X price. And if you can't produce it at that price in your little factory in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, I know somebody in Shenzhen, China that will. And so Walmart helped outsource American industries to China. So it's this concentration where you had one buyer in America that could dictate to 1,000 different businesses in America what they should be producing and selling for, and that one buyer in America could then move production for 1,000 companies over to China. So we had a concentration and consolidation in America, which then on a global level led to the consolidation and concentration in China. And that's the danger. So to unwind this, we now see that Walmart and the big retailers in America see the danger of being dependent on China, but we're going to have to now allow 1,000 companies in America to flourish, and we're going to have to think about, is it good to have just one mass merchandise retailer in America, or 3? And the Wall Street people, that's the other problem, is the Wall Street finance sector also said, well, can we make 1/10 of a cent more on a product by making it in China rather than making it in Milwaukee? And if we can make 1/10 of a cent more on a product, by all means, because they're thinking in terms of 1 billion units, and 1/10 of a cent times 1 billion is like, oh, now we've got some real money here. But Wall Street doesn't care about the United States. They only care about that bottom line. And Wall Street's doing this other very pernicious thing, is they have been steering investments into China. They just want to make their deals. They make fees every time they do a merger or acquisition, every time they do a stock trade. And then in reverse, when these Chinese companies like Alibaba or some other Chinese companies want to be listed on the American Stock Exchange, the Wall Street investment banks and brokerage houses make a fortune with underwriting fees and various fees to help them. So they don't recognize the difference, the fact that these Chinese companies don't have honest accounting practices. They don't have open books to be, that our accountants can go in and look at them. They're not being held to the same standards as American companies. And it's really an unfair playing field. And in addition, you have a number of Wall Street firms that are now, they're called passive investment funds, exchange traded funds, and the 401k retirement plan for American military veterans and for American government workers are being invested in Chinese companies. And these Chinese companies, many of them are under sanction. Many of them are building weapons that are aimed at America. Many of them are involved in the surveillance, the techno-totalitarian surveillance apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party. And what on earth are we doing financing that? Why is the United States financing that? Why? Wall Street's making a buck off it. So they've got to, that's something that needs to be addressed very seriously here.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think Wall Street will change its course by itself.
No, you don't? You think they still like money over there?
I happen to think so. So what's the force that can, obviously this is not in America's best interest, it's not in American people's best interest, but I mean, Wall Street is very, very powerful. What is the force that can, powerful enough to reverse that? Public outcry
and public shaming. And also, there's a few things that can be done. One is legislation, right? We have people like Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Josh Hawley, already asking these questions. Why on earth are we investing the retirement funds of American military people in entities that are producing weapons that are going to be used to kill Americans, right? So there can be legislative fix. There can also be the Security and Exchange Commission, without legislation, at the stroke of a pen, could right now say any foreign company, Chinese or otherwise, that wants to be listed on American exchanges, that wants to be selling its stock or bonds or raising money in the United States of America, has to open its books. It's the same way an American company is required to open its books. There are laws that we have that American companies have to submit their books to an independent audit. The Chinese companies declare it's a state secret. It's like, why are we not enforcing our laws? So number one, we could pass new laws, but number two, even easier, enforce the laws that are already on the books. And number three, the shareholders in these companies, the shareholders in these mutual funds, the shareholders in, let's say, General Motors and Apple could be saying, why are you putting capital in this country which is unreliable, which you can't count on the information you're getting, whether it's about public health, coronavirus, or the availability of electricity, or economic output. So you've got Congress can do something, the executive branch could do something by changing the regulatory environment right now, and shareholders in these large, and most of the shareholders are not mom and pop that own a few shares. We're again talking about large institutional players that own thousands of shares or millions of shares.
Mm-hmm. I have two questions regarding what you just said. I know Senator Marco Rubio has pushed forward some legislations. In my opinion, it's not fast. It's not advancing fast enough.
Correct.
And I know Senator Rubio has written to the TSP board, the Thrift Savings Plan board, and trying to push them to reverse their course. But they said, this is standard industry practice. Everyone else is doing it. I don't think we have a problem. So they didn't do anything.
Right.
And also on the executive branch, I think that's an even bigger question. Do you think the Trump administration, President Trump, is aware of this problem and he wants to do something?
I would agree with you that legislation never moves fast enough. And for somebody that, if we were to place our faith in legislation, I'll be an old man before it comes to pass, or I'll be an older man before it comes to pass. And it's good for bringing attention to things. Unless we had something dramatic happen, I would not expect that legislation to get passed right away. The executive branch, President Trump is increasingly aware of the problem. He is aware of it. He's becoming increasingly aware of it. And what we're seeing just in the last several days is that there are now new people in place in the administration that are making sure that throughout the administration, throughout the federal bureaucracy, we have people loyal to President Trump's agenda in place to advance the agenda that we're talking about. Border security, making American manufacturing great again, and being tough on China, being honest about China. And for too long there have been bureaucratic drift, and there have been people obstructing that agenda, but that's changing. And more every day there are more people in place, and there's more signs that action can be taken. I haven't been specific about what exactly can be done inside the bureaucracy because I don't want to alert the other side as to where to be pushing back on, but I can assure you that these very specific measures that do not require legislation have been identified and are being, the people in the right places are being made aware of it.
This is extremely important.
Extremely important, as is what you do.
Oh, thank you so much, sir. I always have this question in the back of my head. On one hand, President Trump is trying to negotiate a deal with China, a trade deal with China. On the other hand, we have this tremendous, immense institutional investment into China. I think if we try to somehow limit the investment into China, that's kind of going into the opposite direction of a trade deal, because the trade deal, I think, is essentially bring the two economies even closer. So, I mean, what's your thinking?
Well, there are many aspects to trade, and there's many different ways it can be done. It does not necessarily make the United States dependent on China.
You mean the trade deal would not make the U.S. dependent?
It doesn't have to, no. For example, China needs food. Right now they're experiencing incredible food inflation. The price of pork is just skyrocketing. Traditionally, throughout history, China has been afraid of famine. And we hear lately President Xi Jinping, General Secretary Xi Jinping, has said, do not let the virus affect spring planting, because there's this traditional, real as well as cultural awareness of food and shortages of food. So China needs food. Nothing wrong with us selling them food. If we want to sell them agricultural products, sell them pork, sell them wheat, sell them soybeans, sell them sorghum, animal feed, makes perfect sense. We're not dependent on them. If, however, we are buying steel and aluminum, electronics, rare earths, critical minerals from China, then we're dependent on China. And that's a different story. Look back historically at the Soviet Union. We went through many decades of a Cold War. We did business with the Soviet Union. We sold them wheat. We sold them because they were notoriously inefficient at producing enough food. We would sell them that, but we wouldn't sell them critical technologies that they could use for their missiles and bombers and other offensive capabilities. So that's where we have to be careful. We have to differentiate. Not all trade's created equal. Not all products are the same. And it's one thing to have reciprocal trade and a balanced trade. What's the problem here is not that we're trading with China. The problem has been the terms have been horribly imbalanced. And not just on the raw trade deficit numbers, but on the goods. And China has been, the communist China has been subsidizing its industries, artificially deflating the cost of the goods sourced from China in order to capture our technology, capture our capital and investments, and make us dependent on them.
Regarding, the Trump administration is demanding China to do structural changes. And I think essentially those structural changes is demanding the Chinese government to change the way it runs its economy, to change the way it runs the country. And essentially, I think it's a political reform of some sort required of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think those are fundamental things that the Chinese Communist Party cannot do.
Because then it won't be the Communist Party anymore?
Exactly right. So I don't know if there's a fundamental conflict that this trade deal, what essentially is asking China to do, is fundamentally just something that Chinese Communist Party can't do. If that's the case, then what's the solution? What's the path forward?
Well, we're looking at what you're talking about is the initial premise for our opening to China back in 1972 with Richard Nixon, and then in the 1980s, following the Gang of Four, the fall of the Gang of Four, and the rise of Deng Xiaoping. And then particularly the sales pitch that was made in 1999 and 2000 of bringing China into the World Trade Organization and granting permanent most favored nation status to China. The argument that was made was that as China enters into the family of trading nations and into the umbrella of what at the time was a trading club of Western democracies, it would become more democratic and it would start following the rules of free markets, transparency, open accountability, non-subsidization of industries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those kind of structural reforms. The hope was, the dream was, I would say, that this will magically happen. And along with that, then the icing on the cake was as it becomes more prosperous, it will become more democratic. None of that happened.
Right.
We've now seen, this is an experiment that's gone on for 20 years. I think it's a long enough time to run the experiment to say the experiment failed. It has not made those structural changes in its economy. And we see dramatically, it has not become more democratic. So what the trade deal says is, make those structural changes. Do that. Respect intellectual property, respect private property, respect non-predatory pricing. It leaves the politics off the table. Let's get the economics straight here first. And let's see if that happens. Now this phase one deal is very narrow, and it's in a matter of days. China is supposed to submit its plan for respecting intellectual property, and then it's supposed to, in the next 2 years, start making purchases of US goods. We'll see if it lives up to that. But we have to take this wait and see attitude, but those structural changes you're talking about in the China trade deals are exactly what we expected and hoped would happen 20 years ago. And so this is, President Trump is not anyone's fool. He's not taking anybody's word for it. And so well, let's here we go again. Let's see if you actually will do that. And let's not forget our first premises, because that was the premise. As we invest in China, they will reform themselves. But that was 20 years ago, and people have now forgotten, and they think it's just the natural thing. Those people like Wall Street, those people like the top executives, they think it's just natural that you invest in China. It's like, no, let me remind you. We said when you invest in China, they're going to start respecting our rules. Instead, what we're seeing is now that we're invested so deeply in China, they're trying to make us follow their rules. That's not the game.
I'm kind of a pessimistic about this, because I think historically China has never, the Chinese Communist Party, I should say, has never been able to make those changes, even when they were in like real bad situation. They have never been able to make those changes, exactly because that requires the fundamental change of the Communist Party. And I think that's just something they can't do. So I know President Trump has this deal. I mean, he said he can walk away from the deal anytime. So if unfortunately China, the Chinese Communist Party, cannot make those changes, what do you think? Do you think that will lead to an inevitable decoupling of the two economies?
I think what we're seeing already is American companies and Western companies are moving, and Asian companies, Japanese companies, Korean companies are moving away from China. They realize that it's not a reliable partner. The coronavirus has exposed that in a big way. As I've written, American workers have known for 20 years that China has been a bad influence. It's destroyed their jobs. It's been bad for American workers. Now the American management, the American managers are realizing that doing business in China was a bad business decision. It's bad for the business. Before it was bad for the workers, but it was good for business. They could increase their bottom line or their stock price or more profitable. But now we see that it's bad for business as well. So I see that I think the move away from China is accelerating, and this will accelerate it. Independent, and it will also, it could, independent of the trade deal. Whatever happens with the trade deal, people are seeing that it's not a good idea to be dependent on China. Let's move our production out of China. And you know, it's funny, I just want to say this. A lot of the theory around all of these economic decisions, and when I've been talking about bringing American manufacturing back, as President Trump has, bringing manufacturing back to America, the other side always says, oh, that's silly, manufacturing is just a small part of the economy. We're really in a service economy now. More and more people work in service industries. We don't need manufacturing anymore. Well, I would turn that around. I would say, well, if manufacturing is such a small part of the economy, it doesn't matter if it costs a little more to manufacture in America, because people are making their money doing something else. So that's a luxury we can afford, especially if it's a luxury that means when I get sick, I can get the medicine I need to get well, because I don't have to wait for it to be shipped from halfway around the world.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting point. I just want to continue back to what we were talking about before. We said, you said more and more American businesses have seen the detrimental effect of doing business with China. But the institutional investment of the American, big investors have complicated things, because if they invest so much in China using American people's pension funds and all that, so to the point when if China's economy starts to go down, it will hurt the wallets of average American people. Then we lose the leverage, right? So how do you consider this as a whole picture? How do you balance? On one side, you want to push China for a trade deal, and on the other side, you have to be very aware. If we engage too much, then we lose the leverage on China to give them pressure to let them live up to the rules that they are supposed to.
Well, there are limits to what we can do to make China change its ways, right? And the simple fact of the matter is, just by basic economics, basic understanding of business, you don't want to do business with an unreliable partner. So it doesn't make sense to be doing business with a counterparty that doesn't live up to its contracts. So far as the institutional investors being invested in China, there's got to be a sense of patriotism. I mean, people have got to come back to first principles. And these people on Wall Street have to realize they would not be rich, they would not be billionaires if it weren't for this country allowing them to be billionaires and respecting private property and respecting their right to be rich. And they've got to start being responsible to this country.
You still have hope?
I still have hope, yes. I believe in a higher power. I believe in God. I believe that there is something intrinsically good in all of us, that we have to struggle against the intrinsically bad in all of us, but I believe the good is stronger than the bad.
I like that.
But we have to recognize it and acknowledge that and keep calling on that. And it's not enough to say just go along, get along, everything's going to be okay, because people are greedy. We see that every day. People will do evil things. We see that every day. But we appeal to the better aspects in us, and we can overcome these bad things. Martin Luther King said, we can overcome. Look at the civil rights movement. No mistake, no coincidence, it came out of the church, came out of the black church. Everything that you could see, all of manifested reality, the local government, the state government, the national government, the laws, the judges, the sheriff, everything was arrayed against them, saying this is the way it is, there's nothing you can do about it. Go to the police are part of the problem. Go to the judges are part of the problem. Go to the Congress is part of the problem. The Supreme Court said this is the way it should be. Yet they believed we can overcome. There is a higher power, something invisible, something that we cannot see, that cannot be measured, something beyond time and space that will take us to the place we need to go, that will fix these things. I believe that.
I think you have a fundamental faith in the American ideal.
It's even bigger than, yes, and I hope America has a fundamental faith in this fundamental reality, which is beyond what we see.
So do you think the coronavirus epidemic has helped people to realize the danger of relying on China?
It's bringing us back to first principles. It has illustrated in a way that nothing I say could ever illustrate the dangers of being dependent on foreign sources for things like medicine, protective gear, and all of the essential goods for our way of life. It has shown that. You have just-in-time manufacturing where nobody keeps an inventory on hand of the components they need to assemble the finished products. Instead, they're expecting those to be shipped from halfway around the world to arrive just in time to be assembled so they can push it out the door and sell it. That's a fine way of handling inventory. If it's coming from 60 miles away down the road, it's not a good way to do things if you're relying on it to come 6,000 miles away. From a country with a government that you can't rely on, that you don't know how it operates, and that is susceptible to things like this virus. And let's be clear, the reason the virus got out of hand is because people in China who tried to draw attention to it were arrested and told to shut up, don't tell anybody. That's not the way we do business in America. And you can't do business as we are now seeing, you can't do business anywhere with a government like that.
Talking about virus, I remember President Reagan said this thing. He said, communism is like a virus. And I think with virus, you only have two ways to deal with it. Either you kill it or you stay away from it. So that makes me think, what was the right way to deal with the communist China?
Well, with the virus, you contain it, right? You kill it, you contain it. And I've written that the Communist Party is the greater contagion. And it has had a bad influence on the United Nations organizations. It's had a bad influence on the National Basketball Association. It has a bad influence on everything it touches. The same way a virus has a bad influence. The same way what a virus does is it hijacks the cellular mechanics to make the cells start reproducing the virus instead of carrying out the functions that the living organism needs. And the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, is doing something very similar to that. It gets into the National Basketball Association, and then it tells the National Basketball Association, you can't speak out, you can't just talk, no more freedom of speech. You have to carry out the Communist Party line. It's telling American business, you can't do business the way you've been doing it traditionally. You have to shut up and do what we say. It tells Hollywood, you can't make the movies you want to make, they have to conform to our ideology. So that's a very bad influence, and that's everything it touches, it doesn't have a good outcome.
That's right. I want to ask you some big picture questions I ask every guest of mine. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think at the center of American value is freedom, is liberty. So do you think America can achieve true freedom, true liberty without faith?
I don't think America can achieve true liberty and true freedom without faith. You have to have faith in something other than yourself. You have to have faith. Well, let's put it this way. I believe in God, I believe in a higher power, I believe that there's something beyond time and space. There's an infinity and an eternal good. And that's what we have to keep in mind. Unlike the Buddhists, I believe that there is a spark of divinity within us, there's a divine soul, and that's what we have to aspire towards, or that has to be our alignment. The liberty and faith that are American values derive from a faith. The liberty and freedom derive from a faith. They derive from Judeo-Christian principles. They derive from something beyond rational, the rational enlightenment. The rational enlightenment grew from that too. To put it another way, I believe that reason and faith are the two pillars that hold up our civilization, that hold up our consciousness. These are the two pillars of King Solomon's temple, reason and faith. They are not opposed to each other. They're dependent on each other. You can't hold up a structure with one pillar. You have to do both. There are things that are the proper realm of reason, and there's something that is the proper realm of faith, and you have to have both.
Mm-hmm. Do you think today's America is what our founding fathers had envisioned?
I think the best parts of it are what they hoped for. I think they'd be shocked and did not envision the great concentration and consolidation of power in few hands. They believed in private property. I believe in private property. I believe in it so much I think everybody should have some. Unfortunately, there are too few people. Too much property is concentrated in the hands of too few. And this is counterintuitively very much like socialism, where the government owns everything and people own nothing and there's no private property. The corporatization of America, the bureaucratization of America is something the founding fathers would be appalled at. The founders, Thomas Jefferson believed in yeoman farmers, everybody'd have their farm and live in an agrarian paradise. He came around to believing that we needed industry as well. Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, they believed that people would own their own workshops. Not everybody would necessarily be a farmer, but they would have their own workshop, their blacksmith shop, their saddle making shop, their leather shop, their tannery, whatever, their carpentry, and they would own it, and they would own something. Abraham Lincoln believed that people would, they would move out west, we'd give them land, they'd move out west, they'd start a business, they'd start a farm, and people would rather do that than live in the crowded cities of the East. So we need more small businesses, we need more small landholders, we need people working for themselves and having those, the values that come from working for yourself. I think it was the first, Levitt was his name, he made Levittown one of the first suburbs of New York. He said, nobody can be a communist if they own their own home, they're too busy taking care of the yard and the house.
Okay, so so do you think America can still go back to what our founding fathers had designed?
We're in the midst of a presidential election now, where you have one man, Bernie Sanders, who wants to transform America into a socialist paradise, where there will everything free for everybody, and I don't know exactly what everyone will work at, but and he says this with absolute 100% conviction that he can build a society that has never been built on Earth before. I say with absolute 110% confidence that we can do something that has been done before. Have a society where people own their homes, own their businesses, we have competition among different players in the same industry and different owners of different industries. Yes, we can do that. That's the way it's always been done. The aberration is what we're seeing now, this concentration of power and wealth and property in the hands of a few financiers. That's the aberration. That's ahistoric. That's imbalanced. There's no difference if all power and money is concentrated in the hands of Wall Street, or if all power and money is concentrated in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. That's against the laws of nature. So I'm absolutely sure we can do things the way they've always been done and have a society where people can live and own and be happy and take care of themselves, not be dependent on a government, whether it's our government or the Chinese Communist government, for their well-being.
You know, it's interesting. It's to my observation that people who do believe in socialism are the ones who, you know, haven't lived in socialist societies, and they somehow consider socialism as a representing a more like a higher form of morals. So my question to you is, do you think socialism is moral or immoral?
I believe at its base, socialism is immoral, to the degree that socialism is a materialistic ethos. It's an atheistic, materialistic ethos. It's the inverted star of black magic that places material above spirit. It says there is no individual agency. We are not masters of our own fate. We are determined by our material circumstances. If you give everybody enough food, if you give whoever we is, if everybody is given enough material goods, they will be good and they will be okay. That there is no agency in this. I believe that that's inverted, that's upside down. I don't think that material goods determine who we are. I think we determine the material goods, and I believe that there's a divine spirit, something beyond reason and beyond our own cognition, that determines who we are and what we are. There's a force that has a place in this cosmos and in the human cosmology. Socialism discounts that or writes it out of the picture entirely, and in that sense, it's immoral. You know, it's written in the Bible Man will earn his keep by the sweat of his brow. And in the story of Exodus, the children of Israel had to go out in the morning and collect the manna from heaven, right? Manna fell down. They were out in the desert. There was nothing to eat. And they would go out with their baskets and they would collect manna. We don't know what the manna was. It sounded like mushrooms that grew in the morning. And they'd only keep for a day. They had to go back the next day and get some more. They could not, and they were told, only collect enough for what you need for the day. It will not keep. This is all an allegory and a metaphor. The point is, we are supposed to work. We are supposed to do something. It is through the process, the effort, and the endeavor that we find fulfillment. The work is our fulfillment. You will find your sustenance through the sweat of your brow. It is our work. It is our desire to work. That's our incentive and our impetus. That's where we get sustenance from. It is not the material goods. It's the effort and the desire to be a creator. They say also that in the Jewish tradition that we are made in the image of our God, right? We're made in the image of God, and God is a creator. If we're made in the image of God, that means we are creators. That means we must create. And it is by creating that we find fulfillment. It's not necessarily in what we create even that we find fulfillment. The reason we go to work is not to buy a car. The reason we go to work is because it's fun to work, right? Unfortunately, not enough people are having fun doing their jobs, and I would say everybody, get a better job.
So you think, do you think there's a fundamental, do you think there's eternal truth to the founding principles of this country? Or in other words, do you think the founding principles of this country facilitate humankind's ultimate purpose?
Yes, I do think there's an eternal truth to the founding principles of this country. All men are created equal. We're endowed with certain inalienable rights. The rights are not given to us by the government. They're given to us by a higher power. And those, we can't lose sight of that. That is essential to maintaining liberty and freedom and to our well-being, psychological, spiritual, and physical. So yeah.
And that's why this country is powerful and it's long-lasting, right?
That's right. I've said this a long time ago, and I try to keep remembering it. We are wealthy because we're good. By being good, we will be wealthy. It takes a very small twist and error to turn that around, to start thinking we're good because we're wealthy. And that's decadence. We're rich, therefore we're good. That's what Mayor Bloomberg thinks. I'm rich, therefore I'm good. No, you can't think that way. You have to be good, and if you're good and you adhere to the principles, you'll be wealthy. And you'll be wealthy in many ways. So the founding...
And if you're bad, you can become poor. I mean, even if we're rich now, you can become poor.
Yeah.
Right.
Right, and that can happen to a nation. That's the downfall of a nation. When they start thinking we're good because we're wealthy, they won't be wealthy for long. You have to maintain what the Romans called civic virtue. You have to heave to the ancient principles, and then the rest will take care of itself.
Thank you so much, sir. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank
What
you.
a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Great conversation.